Greetings. Today we are starting with the carving of the mandibular, permanent mandibular canine. So I'm going to carve the right side canine. So keeping the block down, crown is up, root is down. I did the labeling. So this is label, this is the label surface. This would be my distal surface. This would be my palatal surface, and this would be my mesial surface. So, starting with the carving, we know that on the labial side, there is a mesial slope and a distal slope. So, this is the center of the block. It says that the mesial slope is shorter than the distal slope. So let's start with the mesial slope. So the mesial slope is towards this side. It should be shorter. So this is my mesial slope all the way right to the back. And this is my distal slope all the way right to the back. So mesial and distal. Now the next thing I need is the labial ridge. The labial ridge that runs on the front of the labial aspect. So we'll take a two-plane reduction, and when you're doing the labial ridge, it can go either in line with the center of the block from mesial to distal, the center of the block. I mark it. So this ridge will come either in line with this, or it could go a little lingual. So I'll do a two-plane reduction. So when I did the two-plane reduction, you can see the labial ridge here running across to the tip. It can, now this has just come to the line that I had made, the crosses from the mesial all the way to the distal. Now, so this is the labial aspect. Now you can see there is a ridge on this side. So it's a two-plane reduction, one towards this side and one towards this side. So it's angulated. When I'm doing a two-plane reduction, I'll always place the lacrons on the surface, and I'm going to remove more from the corner. At the same time, I'm taking the block slanting in like a roof. So it's one way on this side and the other side the other way. Alright, so I have to turn the block like this and do it this way. Alright, so that's a two-plane reduction. Next that I will have to do is converge the block towards the lingual. So now in the canine, mandibular canine, converge the block to the lingual. So both from the distal side as well as from the mesial side, I'm converging the block. So when I'm converging the block, it's like I'm taking it equally towards the lingual. Equally from both the angles, I'm going to cut this all the way down. So just place your lacron straight down here and go all the way down to the cervical line that you have marked. You can go beyond also, because the same thing will extend onto the root later on. But just for now, you just extend it arbitrarily till the cervical. So this, now you are getting a convergence towards the lingual. You can see the convergence towards the lingual. The next step I need to do is to get the lingual ridge. Now in the mandibular canine, the lingual ridge is not so prominent. It is just slightly prominent towards the cuspal portion. So here again on the lingual side, it is a two-plane reduction. So keeping the a line here dividing it into three. So the cingulum area is within the cervical third. However, the cingulum in mandibular canine is not prominent either. So two-plane reduction like we did in the maxillary canine. Two-plane reduction. So now the two-plane reduction, as I was saying, you make it on either side on the lingual so that we get a ridge here. Now on the mandibular, the ridge is not very prominent, but still we'll just carve this part and then we'll change it later on. So you can get it slightly curved on either side, give it a slight curve so that when you look at it here, you can see the lingual ridge here. This is the distal marginal ridge and this is the mesial marginal ridge on this side. So when you're looking at the mesial marginal ridge, you can easily see the lingual ridge also on one side. So it's again a two-plane, giving a slant here and a slant there and maintaining the cingulum here. So this is gross carving. Now once I've got this, now what I can do is I can go for the root now. It is as bulky as ever now, but don't worry, you can straight go for the root carving now. Now, if you look at the length of the canines, the maxillary canine and the mandibular canine, when you compare the length of the crown of the maxillary and the mandibular canine length is, the crown length is about 11 millimeters. Now, when you compare it to the maxillary canine, this is much the length of the crown is this almost the same as that of the maxillary canine, and the root length may be a little shorter or it may be just the same length or slightly longer. So that when you compare the comparatively, when you compare the length of the crown and the root combined in both maxillary and mandibular, they're almost the same. So now let's go for the length of the root. Now I'm just outlining the root here. And what I'm doing is I'm just removing as per the shape of the crown that I have given. I'm just taking it to the length of the root area on either side. So here the length of the root is 16 millimeters. Length of the crown is about 11 millimeters. You can measure that with your scale and keep that in as a reference point. So I've just extended it all the way there. Now what I'll do is I'll just round off the angles, labelly both the angles, lingually both the angles. Now the next thing I'll do is outline the cervical leg, but before that I can just smoothen off the sharp angles on the label side. Cingulum area, just round it off. Now you can if you want, you can measure the length. Okay, you can measure it as 11 on the scale to just mark it properly. So about 11 millimeters from the tip of the crown, from the tip of the cusp. About 11 millimeters will be somewhere here. So this would be my length here. Make it convex outline for this cervical line. Now this is my reference point. I'll extend this all the way around, straight all the way around onto the crown. Now on the mesial side, it dips in about 2.5 millimeters. So I can mark 2.5 from this line. I can measure 2.5. So roughly 2.5 I'll mark here. So this should be where my cervical line should dip in on the mesial. Now on the distal it dips in by about 1 millimeter. So from this cervical line, reference line, it dips in by about a millimeter. Now I'll remove more from the angles as per the shape of the crown. To the markings that I have made both mesially and distally. Keeping the lacrons always flat. Don't keep the lacrons like this at an angle. It should always be flat on the surface when you're removing the wax from the surface of the crown. Root. So you can see I'm removing a little excess here because actually my crown is bulky, so I can do as much as removing from the root. So now you can see that the crown is sticking out as per the shape of the root. Now whatever is excess below this root portion, I'm going to remove it straight down. So up to the so-called base that I'm making, I'll remove the wax to the base portion. Similarly on the distal side. And on the lingual, straight down. So you can see on the label. Now on the label, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave little more on this side and remove from the mesial and distal angles more, so that it becomes more rounded. So from the label, I'm going to the mesial. From the label, I'm going to the distal. And from the distal, I'm going lingually, so that the root is converging lingually. The root has to converge lingually. So I'm starting from the label here. Put a little more down here. Onto my mesial and taking it towards the lingual. From the mesial towards the lingual. So I'm just placing the lacrons flat on the surface and smoothing out the root. Flatten out the base also. So here I have my carving where it looks like a cylinder now, and here we see the crown sticking out. Alright. Now I'm not going to reduce the apical portion now. Let me finish with the crown first. So place my lacrons on the label surface. Go smoothly more towards the borders, that is towards the mesial and the distal. Smoothen it so that you get a convex outline here. Now when you look at the tooth from this aspect, okay, from the cervical line, in the mandibular canine, it does not come outwards so much. It's relatively straight to the crest of curvature, which is usually at the junction of the cervical and the middle, or it could be in the cervical third, and then it moves towards it goes straight towards the tip of the crown, which is located either in the center, in line with the center of the root, or it could be more lingual to the center of the root. So there's a lingual ridge that runs across. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to just smoothen off the label, just slightly run my lacrons onto the label surface giving more emphasis to the ridge, making the ridge a little prominent. Alright. So you know that the mesial slope is shorter, distal slope is longer. So we make that prominent. Now the mesial outline, this is the mesial surface. So the mesial outline on the label is relatively straight in line with the mesial outline of the root. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my lacrons flat on this surface here and just go like this towards the lingual. So I want this to be relatively straight. Now, when I'm doing that, you should never start from the cervical towards the incisal. Now, the mesial outline, as we said, is straight in line with the mesial outline of the root. So to get that, I'll place my lacrons flat on the surface, just move it towards the lingual. Alright. Now the distal outline is slightly concave here. So just below the cervical line it has a concavity. Now you can see that the wax is sticking out. So what I'll do is I'll place my lacrons here and just curve it out on this part. So I get the concave outline here on the distal. Now I'll just smoothen the wax below that slightly. On the distal side. Now I can further reduce the bulkiness here on the mesial, make it relatively more straight. So starting from the cuspal area, bring it down to the cervical. Never do it from the cervical to the cuspal, because when you do that, then the whole thing converges towards the cusp. We don't want that. We want it to converge towards the cervical. Smoothen the mesial surface also of the root. Just very lightly brush it, that's all. Now, again I'm just highlighting the slope, the labial ridge. Smoothening the cervical line, the labial outline just above the cervical line. Now I can re-highlight the cervical line from the root aspect. Take it onto the mesial, dips in by about 2.5 millimeters. Now this dimension, that is the labiopalatal dimension, I need to reduce it. So the cingulum portion, I can just sort of smoothen it off, because on the lingual, the cingulum is not as prominent as in the maxillary. So I have to remove the prominence by just smoothing the cingulum from the lingual aspect. This is my my mesial outline. Always make sure your lacrons cover is flat on the surface. So just remove all the roughness on the surface. Now, my root is looking like a barrel. I have to converge it in the apical area. Now, before I converge, let me make sure I finish the crown carving as much as possible. So, I'll converge the crown towards the lingual. Here I'm finishing the lingual ridge also. The lingual ridge is more prominent only towards the tip of the cusp. It is not that prominent otherwise. So, smoothen it out. On the lingual side, I can go from cervical to the occlusal because I'm just smoothening these areas. But don't do that when you come towards the mesial or the distal. You start from the cuspal area and come towards the cervical because you want it to converge towards the cervical. I've almost finished the crown portion. Now I'm going to taper the root apically. So I want the root to converge apically. So both mesially and distally, I can remove a little from the apical portion. From the apical third, smoothen the block, base of the block. Be very careful when you're doing this because sometimes you may end up breaking the root. Also from the labial, less so from the labial as compared to the lingual. Lingual is where you need to remove a little more excess at the apical. Now, once you've done that, you've seen that roughly the whole thing is getting shape. You have got the tooth converging, the root is converging towards the apical. You can just smoothen it. Make a smooth surface. So you see thin shavings only, I'm not pressing too hard. Very thin shavings coming off. Finish that. Now I just need to polish it, and then once I polish it, I'll show you. So the polishing is the same step that we have always done. So using the muslin cloth, you polish the surface properly. So here we are polishing the carving. Make sure when you polish, you get a nice smooth finish like what I've got now. Alright. Now the next step that we have to do is carve the developmental depressions on the root. So on the mesial and on the distal side, there are developmental depressions on the root. So on the mesial, you have a shallow, relatively shallow developmental depression, just like in the maxillary canines, the developmental depressions on the root are seen. So on the mesial side, relatively smoother. So here you can see I'm using the other end of the Lacron's cover. On the distal side, it's relatively more deeper. Sometimes you have a developmental groove within this depression on the distal side. So the purpose of these developmental depressions on the surface of the root make this tooth very stable. So it's good. That's why these canines are used as anchorage, tooth of anchorage when we are using a prosthetic appliance. So here I've removed the root developmental depressions. Now on either side of the ridge, the lingual ridge, on the lingual side, you have the canine, you have developmental depressions, but they are not very prominent. So I'm not going to give any prominence to this, just very shallow developmental depressions. Very shallow. They are not even, sometimes when you look at the mandibular canine, you do not see the fossas. So the mesial and distal fossas are not very prominent, so I have not carved it so prominent either. Now, once I've done that, I can remove all the loose wax, then finish the polishing. So once I finish the polishing completely, I'll show you once more. So now I've polished the carving, and this is the label aspect. You can see the label ridge that is running on this surface. You can see the mesial slope, distal slope. Mesial is shorter, distal is longer. Mesial outline is straight as per the outline of the root. Distal outline, there is a slight concavity, and then the bulge of the distal aspect. Now, when you look at it from the mesial side or the distal side, let's look at it from the mesial side first. You can see that there is a developmental depression on the root. You can see that the crown starts off, the cervical line starts just above the cervical line, it goes straight, and then it's straight. So it's a straight outline. So the crest of curvature here is actually in the cervical third or the junction cervical and middle, and thereafter the lingual ridge, label ridge, you can see it's going smoothly straight to the tip, which is in line with the tip of the root, or it can be more lingual to the tip of the root. So with the long axis, when you look at the long axis, the tip of the cusp should be either in line or it should be more lingual. Now you can see that the cingulum is not prominent. You can see the lingual ridge running here. It becomes more prominent towards the cusp tip area. The marginal ridges are seen. Now when we look at the lingual aspect, we do not see a prominence of the lingual fossas. So lingual fossas are not prominent in the mandibular canines. Similarly, the cingulum is not prominent in the mandibular canine. But the lingual ridge, it becomes more prominent towards the tip. It's not so prominent towards the rest of the tooth. Now you can see that the tooth is converging both mesially and distally towards the lingual. So you can see a part of the mesial and distal surfaces of the root as well as the mesial and distal surfaces of the crown. Now this is the distal aspect that we are looking at. So as we are, it is in a mandibular tooth, so the root down and the crown up, you can see that the distal fossa, the fossa on the root is more prominent. These fossas are very important because they give a proper anchorage to the tooth. Now you can see the cervical line distally, it is not as prominent. It dips in by about 1 millimeter as compared to the mesial side where it dips up by 2.5 millimeters. Now the rest of it, it's just like in the maxillary canine.